Welcome to your own personal deep dive. We love to get into this source material and really dissect it. And today we're going to be dissecting The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. It's a pretty in-depth look at black civilizations over a huge span of time, from 4500 BC all the way to 2000 AD, and really trying to understand what made them tick, what made them successful, and ultimately what led to their decline.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating about Williams's book is that he doesn't just present us with here's what happened, here's a timeline of events. He's actually, he challenges us to rethink the way that we look at history.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to the agency and the internal dynamics of African societies.
Right. And that concept of agency, I think, is so fascinating here because it's not just about sort of like an uninterrupted rise and fall. It's also about how these societies were impacted by all these forces, both internal and external. And it's really interesting to see how those things intertwine. But before we get into all of that, can we just geek out for a second about the sheer grandeur of these civilizations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Williams is so good at highlighting the accomplishments that oftentimes get overlooked or glossed over in, kind of mainstream historical narratives. He really wants us to understand that these weren't just isolated pockets of, development here and there. These were vibrant societies that were interconnected and influential on a global scale.
When I first read about the Kingdom of Kush, I was floored by their architecture. Because, we always hear about the pyramids of Egypt, but Kush had their own style of pyramids and temples. They're often built with this distinctive red brick that really sets them apart. And that was really fascinating to learn about.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example because it speaks to the fact that Nubia, which encompassed Kush, wasn't simply some kind of offshoot or shadow of Egypt. They had their own powerful kingdoms. They had these distinct artistic traditions, and they were these major players in trade networks that span the entire African continent. I mean, you even have King Taharqa of Kush, who ruled over Egypt for a period of time.
See, that's what I love about these deep dives. It's those little details, those hidden gems that really bring history to life. It makes it so much more fascinating. And, speaking of details, Williams gets into some really specific stuff, like how legal codes that came out of the Arab conquest really impacted land ownership for black populations.
Right.
And it really gets into the nitty-gritty about how these economic shifts happened. It's not just oh yeah, the conquest had consequences. He really digs into the specifics.
Absolutely.
And it's really important to understand that, the Arab conquest of North Africa wasn't some monolithic event. It was this long, complex process. There were periods of conflict, obviously, but there was also this cultural exchange happening. There was the spread of Islam. And so it's, it's a much more nuanced story than just, one army clashing with another. Exactly. And it's not just about armies and battles and all of that.
Yeah.
It's about this whole new belief system.
Yeah.
A whole new way of structuring society that's being introduced into these existing cultures.
Yeah.
So it really, it adds this whole other dimension to this story. And what I find fascinating is how Williams connects the dots between those external pressures that we were just talking about and the internal dynamics of these societies.
Yeah.
He really makes this argument that one of the key factors that made black civilizations vulnerable was the weakening of their traditional institutions.
Right. And I think that's where we get into some really interesting stuff. So, what did that weakening look like?
Yeah, can you give me a concrete example of what that might have looked like in practice?
Yeah. So you can think about ancient Egypt, for instance. The pharaonic system, which had provided stability for centuries, starts to see a real shift in power dynamics, particularly with the priesthood. As the pharaoh's authority declines, the priesthood gains more influence, more control, and this ultimately contributes to the overall destabilization of the Egyptian state.
So it's not just about, some outside force coming in and conquering. It's about these shifts that are happening internally that create these vulnerabilities. It's also cracks in the foundation of a building.
Exactly. And Williams argues that those internal cracks were often exacerbated by external pressures. So you think about the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, which was driven by European powers. This had a devastating impact on African societies, both in terms of the sheer loss of human life, but also the disruption of social and economic structures.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are familiar with just the general idea of the transatlantic slave trade. But what Williams really reveals is the way that it was used very strategically by Europeans to further destabilize African societies. The introduction of firearms, for example, primarily in exchange for slaves. This intensified conflicts between different groups, which made it much easier for Europeans to employ this divide and conquer strategy.
Right. And that strategy of divide and conquer is key to understanding how European powers were ultimately able to establish colonial rule across Africa. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about exploiting those existing tensions, manipulating local leaders to serve their interests.
It's almost like a 1-2 punch,
Yeah.
you know, weaken them from within
Yeah.
and then exploit that weakness to gain control. And this really brings us, I think, to another key aspect of Williams' work, which is his critique of the way that history is often told. He's really trying to challenge those dominant
Yeah, I
narratives.
think he's very intentional about challenging those Eurocentric narratives that dominate our understanding of the past. He
Yeah.
wants to shift that focus to African agency, to the internal dynamics of these societies, and the ways in which they were both shaped by and resisted external forces.
It's about reclaiming the narrative, right? It's about recognizing that history is not just something that happened to people. It's a story that's been shaped and molded by those in power.
Exactly. And he's asking us to be critical thinkers, to question the assumptions that underpin our understanding of history, and to be open to different perspectives. He even challenges some commonly held beliefs about ancient Egypt, presenting evidence that suggests that Black Africans played a much more central role than some traditional accounts would have us believe.
So it's not just about learning like a different set of facts. It's about learning to think differently about the information that we're given.
Precisely. And
Yeah.
that's what makes the destruction of Black civilization such a powerful and relevant work even today. It's not just a history book, it's a call to action. It's a challenge to rethink our understanding of the past and to use that knowledge to build a more just and equitable future. And, part of that call to action is understanding some of those internal factors that Williams gets into. It's really interesting how he connects the weakening of these societies' institutions to a loss of cultural unity.
Hmm. It's almost like as though the fraying of this shared identity made them more susceptible to both internal problems and external pressures.
Exactly. And he argues that, this ability to adapt to maintain that cultural cohesion amidst challenges was crucial for their survival. It's almost like if you can't hold it together from within, it makes you much more vulnerable to those outside forces.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So can we talk a bit more about that idea of cultural unity? Like what were some specific traditions or beliefs that really contributed to that sense of unity in these societies? What were the things that helped them hold it together?
Well, Williams points to the importance of, shared spiritual beliefs, communal practices, things that really reinforce a sense of collective identity and purpose. So in many ancient African societies, for instance, there was this deep reverence for ancestors, this belief in their continued presence and influence in the lives of the living.
So it's not just these abstract concepts.
Yeah.
It's woven into the fabric of their daily lives. It's like how they understand the world, how they understand their place in the world.
Right. And that's what gave them that strength, that solidarity.
Yeah.
But then how did that strong sense of unity start to unravel?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Well, in the case of Egypt, Williams argues that the decline of the pharaonic system went hand in hand with this weakening of those shared spiritual beliefs. So as the pharaoh's authority is challenged, the traditional role of the priesthood, which again was so intertwined with the spiritual life of the community, also begins to shift.
Oh, wow. So it's like pulling on a single thread and then the whole tapestry starts to kind of unravel.
Exactly. And then as we talked about earlier, those internal shifts made these societies much more vulnerable to the devastating impact of the transatlantic slave trade.
Oh, the transatlantic slave trade. It's such a turning point in history, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's just a stark reminder of how human greed and the pursuit of power can lead to unimaginable suffering.
Right. And Williams is very clear about the motivation behind it. It was a calculated strategy to extract wealth from Africa and exploit Black labor for the benefit of European empires. And he argues that, racism and prejudice were certainly factors, but the driving force was economic exploitation.
And I think it's important to bring up here that some historians actually criticize Williams for focusing too much on internal factors. So how does he address that kind of criticism?
Yeah, well, he acknowledges that external forces played a significant role in the decline of Black civilizations, but he argues that understanding those internal dynamics is crucial to seeing the full picture. He doesn't downplay the horrors of slavery or colonialism, but he pushes back against the idea that African societies were simply passive victims.
Right, so it's about reclaiming agency even within a system that's designed to strip it away.
Exactly. And that's where his analysis of the slave trade gets really interesting. He delves into these complex ways in which African societies responded to this unprecedented challenge.
I'm curious about that. What are some of those ways that they responded?
Well, he talks about how some African leaders facing, immense pressure and limited options made deals with European powers, often with the intention of, protecting their own people or maybe gaining some kind of strategic advantage. And this is a controversial aspect of the slave trade, but Williams doesn't shy away from exploring those really difficult nuances.
Yeah, that's the thing about history, right? It's rarely simple or straightforward.
Yeah.
There are always these layers of complexity and these competing motivations at play.
Absolutely. And he encourages us to grapple with that complexity to understand the choices that people made within the constraints of their historical context. But he also highlights the many forms of resistance that emerged during the slave trade.
Oh, yeah. Like, what were some of those forms of resistance?
Well, you have everything from, armed uprisings to much more subtle acts of cultural preservation. He discusses how enslaved Africans developed their own forms of communication, often through music and storytelling, as a way to maintain that sense of community and cultural identity.
Oh, well. So even within a system that's trying to erase their identity, they're finding ways to hold on to it, to pass it down.
Exactly. These acts of resistance, both large and small, really demonstrate that indomitable spirit of the African people.
It's incredible. It's about holding on to hope, finding ways to preserve your humanity even in the darkest of times. And, this brings us back to another really crucial aspect of Williams's work, which is his critique of those Eurocentric narratives.
Yeah, he is adamant about exposing the ways in which those Eurocentric narratives have distorted our understanding of African history. He challenges this notion that Africa was a continent without history, a blank slate upon which Europeans arrived to bring civilization.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most pervasive and damaging myths about Africa, this idea that it was somehow devoid of culture or advancement before the arrival of Europeans.
And he dismantles that myth by showcasing those rich and complex histories of African civilizations. He emphasizes the importance of recognizing the achievements, the innovations, the intellectual traditions that existed long before European contact.
This is where the need for critical thinking comes in, right? It's about being aware of those biases that shape our understanding of history and being willing to challenge those biases.
Precisely. And he provides us with a framework for that critical thinking. He encourages us to question those sources of information, to seek out multiple perspectives, and to be wary of narratives that present a simplistic or one-sided view of history.
And that's so important today. In an age of information overload where it's easier than ever to be swayed by biased or inaccurate information.
And his work is a reminder that knowledge is power. And understanding history, particularly history that has been distorted or marginalized, is essential for challenging those systems of oppression and building a more just and equitable world.
So it's not just about learning about the past. It's about using that knowledge to shape the future. It's amazing. We've been talking for a while now, and it feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much depth to this book. It's really incredible. And one thing that really strikes me is that Williams wasn't just writing for, academics or historians. He really wanted this knowledge to empower people.
Right. And you have to remember, he was writing this during the height of the civil rights movement. So he saw this understanding of history as absolutely crucial for Black Americans to challenge that systemic racism that they were facing.
Yeah, it's like he was saying, look, this is the knowledge you need to fight for your future.
Exactly. And the insights that he provides about how internal divisions, the erosion of institutions contributed to the decline of Black civilizations in the past. Those have direct parallels to the challenges that many communities face today.
It's like he's giving us this roadmap, not just of what went wrong historically, but also how those patterns might be repeating themselves today.
Right. And by recognizing those patterns, we can start to disrupt them. So you think about his discussion of how European powers use the transatlantic slave trade to strategically weaken African societies by fueling those internal conflicts.
Yeah, it's kind of chilling how relevant that feels today.
Yeah.
The way that misinformation and political maneuvering are used to sow discord and division.
It really underscores the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, especially in our current information landscape.
Yeah.
Williams was deeply concerned with Eurocentric narratives shaping how history is understood. But today we have to contend with information manipulation on an entirely different scale.
Right. It's like his call for critical engagement with history has become even more crucial in the digital age. We can't just passively consume information. We have to question it, analyze it, and consider the motives behind it.
And that's where education comes in. He was such a strong advocate for education as a tool for empowerment, particularly for Black communities. He believed that knowledge of history combined with critical thinking skills was essential for social change.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about education.
Yeah.
But how do we go beyond just teaching, dates and names? How do we make sure that education is truly empowering?
Well, for Williams, it starts with decolonizing the curriculum, moving away from those Eurocentric perspectives and incorporating the voices and experiences of those who have been historically marginalized.
So not just like adding a chapter on Black history, but really integrating it throughout the curriculum, showing how it's interwoven with all aspects of human history.
Exactly. And it's about teaching students to think critically about information, to analyze sources, and to challenge narratives that perpetuate harmful stereotypes or biases.
I think that's one of the most powerful takeaways from this book, this idea that knowledge is power, but only when it's combined with critical thinking and a willingness to question the status quo.
And it's a reminder that history is not just something that happened in the past. It's alive, it's evolving, and it continues to shape our world today.
Absolutely. And I think Williams's work is such a powerful testament to the resilience of Black people throughout history. Despite facing unimaginable hardships, Black communities have preserved their cultures, their traditions, their spirit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He challenges us to see Black history not as a story of victimhood, but as a story of strength, creativity, and resistance. And that's a message that resonates deeply, not just for Black communities, but for anyone who believes in justice and equality.
Reading this book, it's not just a history book. It's a call to action. It's an invitation to join this ongoing struggle for a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, it really challenges us to ask ourselves, how are we going to use our understanding of history to make a difference in the world today?
Wow. What a powerful question.
Yeah.
What a fantastic deep dive. I think we've all learned a lot today. So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.